I went to meet Moshe Lavi, whose brother-in-law, Omri Miran, was taken by Hamas militants in front of his family from their home at Kibbutz Nahal Oz on October the 7th. Moshe, thanks for making the time for this. I want to get an update to start with on Omri's situation, what you know about it, because I gather you saw him in a Hamas film video in April. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That was the last time we got any information about Omri. We know that as of late April, and it was confirmed he was alive. That video was shot in late April. What we could gather from the video, we didn't mind the content because it's obviously psychological warfare. But what we gather is that he's much skinnier. He lost the spark in his eyes, the smile. We're very concerned about his well-being, but we're relieved that he's alive, or was alive as of late April. And it gave us motivation to continue and advocate for his release.
Moshe, give me some background. I mean, for those who don't know the story, Omri's story, what happened on October the 7th?
On October 7th, Omri and my sister Lishai woke up to the sirens at 6:29 a.m. in their kibbutz Nahal Oz. And they realized they have to go to the shelter. They took their two young daughters, Alma, who was a half years old, and Ronnie, who was 2.5 years old. They took them to the shelter in the safe room in their home. After a few hours, where they kept communicating with us, the family, my parents in Sderot, who were also in the safe room, my other sister and her family in Oranir, a kibbutz near the border, and myself here in New York. After a few hours of communicating with us, we lost contact with them at around 10:30 a.m. Israel time. And hours later, we discovered what happened. Hamas terrorists barged into their home. They used a teenage boy from the kibbutz, Tomer Arava, to lure them to open the door. Tomer was begging for his life, essentially, for them to open the door, and Hamas has been using him throughout that day. Lishai and Omri opened the door because they wanted to save Tomer's life. Sadly, Tomer was later murdered by Hamas alongside his mother and his mother's partner. They were held captive for a few hours in their home, abused in front of their daughters, and then they were grouped with the Dan family, their neighbors, whose daughter Mayan was murdered, 18 years old. The rest of the family was held captive in their home. They were held together. It was live streamed on Facebook of the mother of the Dan family, Gali. And two more women were introduced to the room, to the house, Judith and Natalie Ra'anan, who were American citizens who visited the kibbutz. And in the afternoon, around 1:30 p.m., Omri was taken hostage in front of Lishai's eyes. He was brought up, handcuffed alongside Tzachi Dan and Judith and Natalie Ra'anan. They were instructed to leave the house with the Hamas terrorists. Lishai told him she loves him, she'll take care of the girls, and ask him not to be a hero because she wants him back. And eventually, that was the last time she saw him. They were held captive for a few more hours in the kibbutz, but eventually was rescued around 5:30 p.m. by the IDF. But Omri was long taken by then. So
Lishai, Amra and Ronnie were actually able, they managed to get them, the IDF managed to
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, one of the things I guess as a journalist I know we see a lot, the kind of the horrors on both sides. We see numbers of people killed. It's always about statistics, usually in the media, and it's easy for people to forget it's about individuals and their lives. So just give me some background on Omri and his family, what sort of person he was, and you know how he fit into the community.
Omri was 46 years old when he was kidnapped. He marked his 47th birthday in captivity in April. He is a shiatsu therapist and a gardener in the kibbutz. And that really captures who he is, a spiritual person who is connected both to the land of Israel, to the soil as a gardener, but connected as well to other cultures, other forms of spirituality through his shiatsu training. We love to say that he healed people and nature in his profession. He is a devoted husband to my sister Lishai. He wanted to make sure she develops her career in Sapir College, the flagship college in our area of Israel, the Gaza envelope. So he would spend a lot of time with the girls. He loves sports, especially basketball. We support the same team, which was very important for his introduction to the family, Maccabi Tel Aviv. He loves nature, loves hiking, is an avid reader, especially of Haruki Murakami, a Japanese author. He has all his books in the library. And we miss him so much. His smile is what I think of him every time I think of him, because it's such a wide smile, bashful smile, that emphasizes the sort of person he is, looking optimistically about life. And we learned in November, when some hostages were released in the previous deal between Israel and Hamas, that he uplifted some hostages in captivity, using his training as a shiatsu therapist. And I wasn't surprised to learn that.
And he was, of course, taken at a time when his daughters, Amra and Ronnie, were still very young. I gather Amra, the youngest, she hadn't even started walking, so he missed her first steps.
Yes, Alma.
Alma, sorry.
Yes, Alma walked her first steps a few months ago. He missed that. She started speaking. He missed that. He missed her first birthday, also in April. It was a very sad birthday for us to mark, but we made sure to mark it because she deserves a sort of celebration and the hope of having her father returning to her. You know, Ronnie, the eldest, who will celebrate her third birthday in July, said a few weeks ago to my sister Lishai, "Daddy missed your birthday, Daddy missed Alma's birthday, he missed his own birthday, but I really want him back for my birthday in July." And we told her we are going to keep fighting and making sure that Omri will be released by then. But it's already June, and July is very close, and I don't know if we'll be able to fulfill that promise.
It's hard for the youngsters, presumably, of course, they're just, so young. But there are other families, Moshe, out there also like you, waiting and hoping regarding news of the hostages, hoping to get their loved ones back. Do you have a community where you work together, support each other, or are there people who have their family members or loved ones taken hostage who want to deal with it alone?
I'm sure there are those who choose to deal with it alone, but I can share with you that the majority of families are part of an organization, grassroots organization called the Hostages and Missing Families Forum. It's a grassroots organization started by the families, for the families, on October 8th. And it provides us the platform to advocate effectively with policymakers, whether in Israel, whether internationally, here in Washington, D.C., for example, of course, in New York and worldwide. And we also use that platform to be together, to share our frustration, to share our emotions, to share our thoughts. And sometimes there are disagreements and arguments, but what is beautiful about this community is that we all became one big family, sadly for terrible reasons. People came from different backgrounds, from different areas of Israel, because people were kidnapped from the party and from the communities on the border. But it's a platform that gives us a lot of strength and hope to continue our struggle.
Now, to some degree, you've become not only a spokesperson for Omri and your family, his direct family and your family, but also for some of the other hostage families, because, of course, you engage very heavily with the media. And I'm wondering how you regard the way the media has covered the Israel-Hamas situation and the conflict, and especially the way the hostage situation has developed.
It is a complex question. I think on one hand, I'm thankful that the international media has been covering this crisis and been focusing on the hostages, specifically as the war evolved, and is inviting us to keep sharing our thoughts and keep sharing our advocacy work, which is, I think, most important. On the other hand, I'm very frustrated with the way some media outlets have been handling the crisis. Some have been describing the hostages as prisoners, which was very saddening for me to see, because these are not prisoners by international law standards and are not considered prisoners by the ICRC, but are hostages. And I think there's also a level of populism in the way they've been engaged in the topics to some degree. What is important to me is that we'll keep covering the issue of the hostages, keep emphasizing that they're human beings and that this is a humanitarian issue. It shouldn't be a political issue. And that's the same for the terrible conditions of Gazans as well. They are human beings, and we need to treat them as such and not as numbers within a war. We're in the 21st century, and we can bring the human element to the forefront of those spectators and make sure that we don't provide narratives that dehumanize whether Israelis or Palestinians.
Interesting you mentioned terminology, prisoners versus hostages, and the way that terminology is used in the media, because words like genocide come up, another Holocaust come up. How do you regard it when the media talks in these terms?
I think it's important that the media plays a constructive role, which means it doesn't try to incite or inflame the discourse. Sadly, there are a lot of disinformation agents that are inciting on social media, inciting on the streets, and we saw it only recently here in New York this week with the terrible demonstrations in front of the Nova Festival Memorial Exhibition, where people were waving Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags, chanting terrible things against the victims of the tragedy, of the atrocity. But the media needs to cover this in a constructive way. There are legal definitions, and they can't simply apply legal definitions that have not been proven to be correct. They cannot simply use terminology that only incite and inflame the worldwide opinion, and they should not publish things before they were examined. And I'll give you an example. CNN a few days ago sent a push notification about the rescue operation of the 4 hostages. In the push notification, they said that there are over a few hundred casualties per the Ministry of Health in Gaza. And then when you enter the article, it says at the end, CNN could not verify this information. So instead of sending push notifications like that, send possible non-combatants who were killed, and then make sure that you examine it. So that's my issue with the traditional media. They need to be more constructive, they need to be more careful in their wording, and make sure that they don't elevate those who are disinformation agents, those who are trying to create a toxic discourse.
How do you regard the campus protests that took place on a big scale globally, and not just here in the US, just down the road actually in Columbia University, for example, the way the authorities handled them, and also then certainly from the Israeli spokespeople that I've been in touch with, they called it just basically anti-Semitic?
It's a personal subject for me because I went to college here, I went to graduate school here in the US, and some of the most troubling demonstrations were in New Penn, where I went to university. I think it's important to preserve the right to demonstrate and preserve the right for freedom of speech in this country and in any democratic nation. And students have been trying to speak to that. But at the same time, it's important that those students, and especially the outside agitators who are joining them, and sadly in many cases, including New Penn and in Colombia, they found that outsiders joined those demonstrations and inflamed them further, that they don't use rhetoric that is hateful and that incites to violence, that they don't elevate designated terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah, that they keep their criticism constructive. It's fine to criticize the state of Israel just as it is fine to criticize the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or any other state or non-state actor in the world. But at the same time, you can't simply call for the eradication of a country, a UN member state. You can't simply deny the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. And I don't deny the Arab-Palestinian connection to the land of Israel, and I don't expect others to do it the same. I want to make sure that students who watch this and students and generally engage in this in a constructive way, make sure that they don't use toxic rhetoric, hateful rhetoric, and also invite others to the camps. Because journalists were harassed. Only a few days ago, they were harassed in UCLA, where a new encampment was established. That everyone is welcome to the discourse, that things like Zionism are not used as slur, but as simply an ideology.
Do you think it is, though, essentially anti-Semitic just to protest against Israel?
No, I don't think. I think everyone has a right to, as I said, to demonstrate against the state of Israel. What could be anti-Semitic is the statements you make, is the the vilification of Jews, the vilification of the idea the state of Israel is a Jewish nation state, just like Ireland is the Irish nation state and France is the French nation state. Israel is the Jewish nation state. Vilifying it, only concentrating on Israel, is the problem. If you do it in the context of, I oppose all nation states in the world, I oppose the idea of a state, that's perfectly fine, but you can't single out one country.
The other thing that has changed in this dynamic over the last couple of decades is the impact of social media. How has social media affected your cause and your efforts on behalf of Omri? And not only that, what kind of response have you had from people? Because it seems there's a lot of hateful rhetoric, whatever you do, when it comes to social media.
Yeah.
Have you faced a lot?
We face a lot of hateful rhetoric. Whether on Instagram, where we ran a page for Omri, where we try to share his story, like you discussed earlier, try to share moments from his life, try to share who he is, who his family is, and try to share our message, which calls for a hostage deal that will bring about the release of the hostages, and also alleviate the suffering of the Gazans by bringing about a ceasefire. And also on Twitter, we use that platform in order to echo what we do, our advocacy with policymakers, whether in Israel, here in the US, in Europe, and our thoughts about developments, and also sharing there the human story about Omri. And yeah, we got a lot of hate messages, whether DMs or directly as in comment section. I try and focus on the good people, and there are good people everywhere. And I can tell you that through X, I was able to engage with Arab Palestinians in the past few months that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
With support?
With support. We don't have to agree on everything, and we definitely do not agree on everything, but we agree on the principle that Israelis are human beings, that Palestinians are human beings, and that they can have a constructive discourse. And that's something that is sadly being sidelined. And the traditional media is also playing a part here because they elevate the radical voices on the streets, on social media, instead of elevating those moderate voices that we need to hear more, whether they're Israeli or Palestinians.
How do you regard the way Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has handled the situation? It's created a lot of protests within Israel.
It's hard for me to commentate because I'm not a policymaker, I'm not an elected official, I'm not a military strategist. I'm a mere citizen who voices opinion, and I do it, whether when I'm in Israel, through rallies, through meetings, and of course here in the US. I think Israel have done many mistakes in how it conducts the operation strategically and tactically. But at the end of the day, the pressure is on them. I can't really criticize those who are put in such pressure in order to make sure that we bring home the hostages, in order to make sure Hamas is held accountable for the atrocious crimes they committed on October 7, and make sure that this is not repeated. I hope that the Israeli government, the current government, and any future government will make sure that this will not happen again. In my belief, this will not happen again, both by using military option, but also using a vision for the future for us in the region. And that includes agreements with our neighbors, the Palestinians, and of course with the wider region. Only in September we were speaking about normalization with Saudi Arabia. And I think having such process reignited will change the region forever and make sure radical elements like Hamas will not be able to regain the sort of popularity they've had in Gaza.
Until now, then, you were very optimistic about the relationship building within the Middle East. I'm
realistic that this is not an easy process. It will require changes in the way education system work. It will require changes in the mindset of people, both in Israel and of course in Arab countries. And it will require the acknowledgement that the state of Israel exists, that Zionism is a manifestation of self-determination, enshrined right given to all people, including the Arab Palestinians, to self-determine themselves. I'm realistic that these are long-term processes, but we have to make concrete plans for the realization of that vision. It may take decades, may take centuries. How many centuries it took Europe to be a relatively peaceful place, and it's not a peaceful place yet. And with the rise of the radical right and radical left elements in Europe, you can see that this could be destabilized again. But how many centuries it took them? It took them a long time, and it will take the Middle East a long time as well.
Let's get to your personal story, because you yourself served in the IDF as a captain, and you were actually in Gaza at a time when it was going through its troubles a decade ago. Tell me about that experience.
Yeah, I served in the IDF for 6 years. I was a captain in a unit called COGAT, Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories. And I was stationed on the Israel-Gaza border. And I was interacting with Palestinians all the time, workers of international organizations, of the Palestinian Authority. And to be honest, after the 2014 crisis, the conflict, when I served, I was hoping we'll see the reconstruction of Gaza, a mechanism we implemented in place with the international community as the stepping stone for a more peaceful future for both Gazans and Israelis. But we sadly saw 10 years later that this is not the case. Hamas has used that mechanism in order to build up its military capabilities at the expense of the Gazans, and at the same time, developments between the Israelis and the Israeli government and Palestinian Authority has not become fruitful. So we couldn't see any agreements for a two-nation-state solution.
A quick question then. How did your time, 6 years in the IDF, on the front line dealing with what is essentially a conflict situation, how did that change your perception of Palestinians?
I'm coming from a unique background. I grew up in Sderot on the Israel-Gaza border, so my interactions with Palestinians was in my early childhood based on them coming to our town and interacting with us. And then after that, my experience was being bombarded on a regular basis in my town, Sderot. And of course, experiencing the horrific terror attacks at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. But then I went to an international boarding school in Norway, United World College, and studied with Palestinian students, including students from Gaza. And was able to interact with them on a human level and interact with people from other countries as well in the region, such as Jordan, such as Egypt. So my mindset was always that we have to recognize the humanity of each other, have to recognize our existence as human beings, and also as having a nationality of our own and wanting to live and coexist in our region. And I used that experience to implement it during my service. And I will always view my counterparts the same way I view them in my school. Human beings like me, and that we need to try and find solutions. I understand that the dynamics when you're in the military is different, but the solutions always need to be how we can make this situation better.
And there's an irony that the media, perhaps unintentionally sometimes, or most of the time, portrays a situation where all Israelis hate Palestinians and all Palestinians hate Israelis, and that there is no common ground. You're obviously presenting a very different picture based on your experience. To what degree do you think your experience and your attitude of some kind of unity is more widely held in Israel than perhaps is reported?
In my opinion, the underlying tone among most Israelis is that we want to be part of the region, that we want to be we want to solve the conflict both with the Palestinians and with the wider Arab world. At the same time, we also have a realistic approach. We felt burned during the Oslo process, after the disengagement plan from Gaza, during the negotiations between the Olmert government and Mahmoud Abbas government, and with everything that evolved in the Palestinian territories over the past decade, and past 2 decades. But at the same time, I think the underlying tone is we can solve this in the long run, and we want to solve this. What we need is to see that the situation can change on the ground. And I'm going back to education. You know, the UAE and Israel reached an agreement a few years ago as part of the Abraham Accords. And as a result of that agreement, the UAE changed their education curriculum. They made changes to the way they portray Israelis, they portray Zionism, they portray the state of Israel. The Saudis are undergoing the same process right now. We need to see that in the curriculum in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This is called de-radicalization. And we have issues in our curriculum that we will need to change as well in Israel. Once we implement de-radicalization, once we learn to recognize each other as human beings with inalienable rights for self-determination, I think we'll be able to solve this. But sadly, we keep getting back, to the beginning point, which is a conflict. And it started a long time ago, and it may continue for many more years. But if we'll actually talk about changes, we might be able to implement some of them.
So then, Moshe, obviously this was a terrible situation, October the 7th. It's ongoing, as you experience personally, even now, with the fact that Omri is away, being held. What goes through your head when you see the horrendous pictures coming out of Gaza? Because there's been 7 months plus of this now.
Yeah, I mean, we're experiencing the war since October 7 ourselves, with the displacement of Israelis in the south and the north, burning of our communities, the destruction of our communities. And the same happens to the Gazans, who are even more vulnerable, because unlike us, where our government invested in infrastructure of defense as well, like shelters, like the Iron Dome, Hamas has not invested in that. They invested in tunnels to protect their own fighters, to protect their leaders. And Gazans are viewed as mere numbers, as collateral damage for Hamas as well. It's hard for me to see this, and I can't.
It's the scale, it's the numbers.
It's the scale, it's the footage, it's everything. And while I understand why it happens, and while I understand that, again, the talking points that we don't see in the media is the civilian to combatant ratio, the issue of how urban warfare is conducted. And we see a lot of incitement and counterproductive activity of the international community as well to solve the crisis. But on a human level, it hurts me to see the Gazans, which is why I hope they'll be able one day to rise up against those radical elements that I think are bringing them to this point, just like we need to rise up against our radical elements in Israel. And you see widespread demonstrations. You've seen it before the crisis, which is why Israel was so vulnerable on October 7th, because for months people were demonstrating against the current government. And you see it today, where people are trying to make sure that the focus of the government is on the hostages, is on finding strategic solution to a strategic problem, the Gaza Strip, and not only using it tactically and advancing a vision of a Pyrrhic victory, which isn't going to change things on the ground. But I want Gazans to understand as well that they can't continue and elevate the radical elements as well.
Don't you worry that with the conflict being so prolonged and so horrific right now, that there is now another generation or two of radicalism being instilled into the young generation that's seeing what's happening? I mean, it seems to be counterproductive.
I think that's why we need a day after plan. You could have said the same about what happened in the Second World War. Both the allied countries and, of course, the Axis were destroyed. Cities were leveled to the ground, and people would be viewed as being radicalized, as ethnic cleansing happened in Eastern Europe, as the Holocaust happened. But and of course, what happened in Japan with the 2 atomic bombs and the horrific war between the Americans and Japanese with the rest of the region. But we saw a day after plan, the Marshall Plan, the de-radicalization and denazification plan. That's what we need to see in the Gaza Strip and in Israel. But at the moment, I don't see enough people in the leadership in both nations talking enough about that. And I want to use this platform to call the international community to emphasize that the hostage deal is the first step. And after that, we need to start implementing a day after plan, and that cannot include radical elements like Hamas, like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, because they will bring us back to the starting point, which is a conflict.
So you don't ever worry that the hostages could be seen under certain circumstances as, collateral damage, that the government would write them off as collateral damage? You never would expect that.
I would have expected that, and We are communicating with the Israeli government on a regular basis. We meet policymakers up to the prime ministers, elected officials, and we never received that impression from the majority of the elected officials we met. I think there are radical elements in our government that may speak otherwise, but the mainstream view that represent the majority of members of the government, of the parliament, of the Knesset, does not see it like that, and I cannot believe it will ever, because it's part of our ethos, part of our culture, and for those who are religious Jews, it's part of our religion.
Let me get on to a couple of issues that have been very much in the news lately. What went through your head when you heard about the rescue plan that got 4 Israeli hostages out? Obviously nearly 300 Palestinians killed in that process. Is there a justification? Obviously you're thinking about your loved one, Omri, but is there a justification for that kind of action?
I'll start with this point. Israel is doing what it needs to do to bring back its hostages, and that will mean as well military operations. It would not have been needed to do that if they were not kidnapped in the first place. And in this case, 4 civilians who were kidnapped from the Nova party were rescued, and they were held by supposedly non-combatants in a civilian building within a densely populated civilian area, Nuseirat Market. As Yahya Sinwar said in the leaked documents that were published in the Wall Street Journal, this is a strategy Hamas is implementing purposefully. And I think that creates collateral damage. And we call it collateral damage, but at the end of the day, these are human beings who were killed as a result of military decisions, as a result of their own leadership decision. That's why, in my opinion, the best way to bring home the hostages is a hostage deal. It's the only viable way to make sure they return home and that we de-escalate the conflict and reach eventually a ceasefire that hopefully in the long run could create opportunities for a long-term peace. So I was relieved and joyful to see that the hostages were rescued. I'm commending those who were risking their life to save them. At the same time, I have pain for those who were impacted, who were non-combatants. I don't know the figures because as of now, Hamas has not provided actual names of most of the numbers they provided, and I don't trust their numbers. As AP published only a few weeks ago, they see that there are inconsistencies with the numbers. The UN itself said it a few months ago. And so I can't trust their numbers, but I do want to emphasize that every person who loses their life in Gaza who is a non-combatant, not affiliated with Hamas, I pain for them.
As someone born and raised in Israel, and still very close to the country, and family there, how do you regard the decisions by the ICC and the ICJ that now basically points the finger at Israel as well as Hamas?
I'm not a legal expert, so I can't really comment on that. Israel has its own legal experts and they're handling it.
But as an Israeli, your gut feeling when you're told that there is an international community court that is saying Israel could be guilty of genocide, what do you think?
I think we could have used that accusation against any urban warfare that has been conducted ever, but it hasn't been. Sadly, countries are using those courts for political maneuvers and not in order to constructively solve the crisis. I haven't seen such kind of cases being brought up against even the US and of course countries such as Syria that has done a horrific genocide of its own people possibly, or at least intentionally killed its own citizens in the civil war. I don't know, I don't want to use these definitions. It pains me to see that the international community has turned its back to Israel, but at the same time I recognize that mistakes probably were made, that rhetoric is too inflammatory as well from the Israeli side, and so we have been calling our own government, our own elected official, mind your words, and even if you're not acting with your words and you just want to express your frustration, remember you're not a common citizen, you're not the average person on the street who can speak like that. You're an elected official and every word you say has a weight. I don't know if those words were translated to policy. I don't believe they were, because I've been on the ground and I know how policy has been implemented in the past. But at the end of the day, it's going to affect us. I hope that the crisis will be solved and we'll be able to solve that as well.
At the citizen level, how do you feel about the strategy your government or Israel's government has essentially implemented? Has it worked? Is it going in the right direction as far as you feel?
I sometimes voice my opinion on X, or of course with conversations as well in the media. I think there were strategic mistakes done from the beginning of the war that sadly prolonged it. I think strategic mistakes are being done related to the hostage crisis, but I'm focusing on that. I hope that after this war and after we'll solve the hostage crisis, there will be a committee in Israel, a national committee, that will make sure that those who failed on October 7 and after October 7 will be held accountable. And only such committee will be able to bring those conclusions for the Israeli public. That's what I believe any thriving democracy has to do.
I've interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu a number of times over the years, I mean quite a few years ago as well. He's been around a long time. I hope to get a chance to speak with him again. But if you could sit in front of him right now, what would you ask him or what would you say to him?
Our family sat with the Prime Minister on several occasions. What we keep saying is, remember your own words in the past where you said the redeeming of captives is above any other objective. It should be above any other objective, and it is a primary objective in this war, and bring about a release through a viable hostage deal. That's all I ask for my Prime Minister, irrespective of political disagreements. I trust he's doing what he needs to do in order to bring them home. I commend the plan that was proposed, the hostage deal plan, a very difficult plan to digest for Israel. I commend that they proposed it, and I don't pay heed to the rhetoric that is directed to political bases. What matters is what you do behind closed doors in the diplomatic world, and they put that plan. What we need is that Hamas accepts that plan, and they today, sadly, as Secretary Blinken said, propose changes that cannot be worked around. So they need to say yes.
Actually, I was going to ask you if you had a chance to sit in front of Hamas's leadership, what you would ask.
I will ask them, why? Why have you committed this crime against your own people? Why have you destroyed the Gaza Strip in a way that is counterproductive for the Palestinian self-determination cause? And why have you committed such horrendous crimes against some of the most peace-loving communities in Israel, and against the citizens of Israel, against foreign tourists, irrespective of their religion, irrespective of their nationality? Everyone was targeted on October 7. I'll ask them why. Because this is not going to achieve the goal of the majority of Palestinian people who simply want to live in security, comfort, in their own state. That's what I'll tell them. And I wish we'll be able to bridge the gaps, but I don't think Hamas can bridge the gaps. But there are elements in Palestinian society who can.
Now, of course, the motive, or not the motive, the end goal perhaps from the Israeli leadership has modified a little bit, saying that essentially Hamas should be disabled or unable to carry on any attacks. Before it was, we have to wipe out all of Hamas at any cost. As someone who served in the IDF, who knows the front line, is it even possible to get rid of Hamas?
I think, and let me use my education instead, as I studied history and international relations and have various degrees in those fields. It's hard to destroy ideological terrorist movements without addressing root causes. And the root causes go beyond the agenda, which in my opinion is a genocidal, anti-Semitic agenda that Hamas has, which is to wipe Israel off the map and implement a Sharia state in Israel and in the Palestinian territories and the wider region. But there are root causes, and one of them is the prolonged Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the disputed territories, the ongoing suffering of the average Palestinian, both from their leadership and as well from decisions made by the Israeli leadership. So to address Hamas, we need to address the root causes. We might be able to dismantle them, we might be able to disable them, but there will always be someone else to replace them. We need, after we dismantle Hamas, and I believe we have to dismantle them after what they did to their own people and to our people, we have to change course strategically. And that's part of the normalization plan with the Saudis and with the wider region, and of course the resumption of the peace process with the Palestinians.
Moshe, in your eyes, how important is the role of the US president at this stage?
The US is important in every corner of the world. And of course in the context of this conflict as well. I think the Americans have been supporting us, the families of hostages, from the first day. Have been supporting overall the state of Israel, after the most horrific attack against Jews in one single day since the Holocaust, the deadliest attack. But they were also counterproductive in the way they aired grievances publicly instead of behind closed doors, counterproductive in the way they did not pressure Hamas and their sponsors, such as Qatar, in a more effective way. And there were policies that could have been implemented in the first week that they didn't. And families of hostages have been telling them, freeze assets, disable the right to movement of those Hamas leadership. Don't renew the plans, the plan with the American base in Qatar, without a resolution to this crisis. And there's so many other suggestions. So while at the same time I appreciate their support for us personally and for Israel, I think they were counterproductive, and they help prolonging the war and emboldening Hamas and their accomplices.
Do you question the motives of those involved in the mediation process? Like Qatar, you've got Egypt in one sense, you've got America in the others, and others thrown in the mix. Is it the wrong group to be mediating this?
I don't know who is right to mediate it, but these are the actors that are currently relevant. If anybody has more creative proposals, please bring them forth. Qatar has been funding Hamas for a long time, has been harboring their leaders in Doha as part on the behest of the United States, and also in a quiet agreement from Israel. So they're a player in this conflict. Egypt is a player because they have a border with the Gaza Strip, and for many years they allowed Hamas to keep smuggling weapons through tunnels, to keep smuggling money through tunnels, and basically violating the Camp David Accords. We only discovered the large scale of it in the past few months after Israel was able to enter Rafah. So I don't trust them. And what happened a month ago with the Egyptians changing the agreement Israel agreed to so that Hamas will say yes, that hasn't been productive in any ways. But at the end of the day, they are there on the table, and I trust my own government to do what they can to use those mediators in order to reach a resolution with Hamas.
When you hear about potential ceasefires and peace proposals on one day and then more military action the next day, what does it do to your optimism and expectations for Omri's release?
I'm always optimistic that we'll reach a resolution for the hostage crisis. But what I'm not optimistic about is that we'll reach it early enough. And which is why we've been calling for months here in the US, in Israel, in Europe, wherever you want. We met regional actors as well, including Qatar. We need to reach a resolution as soon as possible. They are dying there. They are being tortured. They are being starved. They are being beaten. And at the end of the day, the crisis, the hostage crisis, also prolonged the wider war. So I'm realistic at the same time, but optimistic we'll reach eventually a resolution. I just want to make sure everyone understands we need to do it as soon as possible. Otherwise, everyone will continue to suffer. And at the moment, there is, again, a proposal on the table. We need Hamas leadership to say yes. We need them to understand they cannot hold hostage Israeli citizens. They cannot hold hostage citizens of other countries, and they cannot hold hostage their own people. They need to agree to this deal so that we can continue to the next phase, which is reconstruction. And what I hope is to see as well Hamas leadership being removed from power and leaving the Gaza Strip in embarrassment by their own people, by the Gazans. They do not deserve to stay in the Gaza Strip after what they did to their own people and to Israel.
I wonder, Moshe, how have the events of October the 7th changed your opinion about how Israel and Gaza, the situation can be resolved, and also what the potential is for a long-term solution for Israelis and Palestinians in general when it comes to living side by side in a two-state solution?
I'm going to stay a man of peace, no matter what happens. No matter what happens to my family and happened to my family, to my people, and we pain and we are angry and we are frustrated, I'm going to continue to advocate for a long-term solution, peaceful resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and for the entire and to the conflict with the entire Arab world. And so I hope that we will see, I hope we'll see it in my lifetime. But as I said earlier, these processes could take decades and centuries, so we might not see it in our lifetimes. But someone will see it. I have no doubt about it. But I want to look on leaders in their eyes and tell them, if you can solve it now, why wait so many centuries? Why wait for bloodshed to be, for the bloodshed to continue, for Israelis to be killed, for Palestinians to be killed by this conflict? Don't wait. Sit and talk and find a resolution. The topics were exhausted for so many rounds of negotiations in the past. We know the parameters that are needed to reach a resolution. How can we implement it? Think creatively, think out of the box, think about de-radicalization, changing the education systems, making sure that both people see each other as human beings rather than as enemies. And I hope I'll be able to say it one day to stakeholders in the region as well. You know, a few months ago, some of the families met relevant stakeholders and said, maybe you should bring us to Saudi Arabia so that we can show the entire region that we families of hostages and the Saudis can offer a better vision for the region, Israelis and Saudis. And I will still call for that with any actor in the region. But at the moment we are experiencing the most painful point in my life, in our history, in my opinion, in the relation between the Israelis and Palestinians, and we'll have to overcome it somehow. I really hope we'll overcome it during my lifetime.
Moshe, thank you for a very candid discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, those were the thoughts of Moshe Lavi, who waits anxiously to know the fate of his brother-in-law, Omri Miran. We've now heard two perspectives on the same story at a key moment in the conflict. Different stories, but united by a common hope that the fragile peace process can result in a lasting peace for Gaza and the return of the hostages. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.